Solomon points out something. It's not always so. We may make assumptions about what we think are automatic locks because of, look, the strongest is better than the weakest, the fastest will always be better than the slowest, the smartest will always be better than those who are not intellectually, have a capacity intellectually. And we would just make those things locks. But note what he says at the end of this verse here. He says, life under the sun is not that way. Note what he says. I saw this under the sun. That the assumptions we would naturally make, and those assumptions we would be assured of, the race to the swift, the battle to the strong, bread to the wise, riches to men of understanding, it's not that way. Because life under the sun is not 2 + 2 = 4. Note what he says at the end of verse 11. Time and chance happeneth to how many of them? All. Time and chance happeneth to them all. Though one may have absolutely everything listed in the first section, Solomon reminds us that things in this world do not always happen the way we expect them to. One author writes it like this. It is also true that these same gifted people can fail miserably because of factors out of their control. The successful person knows how to make the most of time and procedure, but only the Lord can control time and chance. Another author put it like this. We are all victims, if we can say it that way, of time and chance. Solomon here is not abandoning his position that our God is sovereign. He's merely looking at the arbitrary nature of this life from a human perspective rather than a theological perspective. See, though one could utilize wisdom, skill, etc., in an advantageous manner to enjoy one's life and bring honor to God, we need to remember something. Merit in and of itself is not always rewarded, and our sin-cursed world is unfair. I say that even our gracious and merciful God will orchestrate and allow times that are contrary to your desires and to my logic. Things that we thought should come to pass, things that we thought were a lock, our God will not always do so. Solomon's been trying to help us embrace that truth since chapter 3. He makes all things what? Beautiful in his time. There is an appointed time for this, an appointed time for that. There is a time for everything and a purpose to be fulfilled at a specific time, as he told us in chapter number 8. So here he says, time and chance happeneth to all. Now, let's not be misguided by the word chance. It just simply means occurrence or event. It has nothing to do with gambling or haphazardness. He's just trying to help us understand there is not this level of assumptuous predictability that you and I would think there is. See, a man's thoughts, our abilities, we think should determine the assurances of our life or the directions of our life or the enjoyments of our life. But Solomon says, you don't live a life like that. And if you think that will make you happy to have that rock-solid assurance of knowing what will come down the pike every single time, he said, you're going to be sadly disappointed, and it will not make you happy because you are living a life that has a looming death sentence, and you, my friends, are living a life filled with unpredictability. So don't make your assumptions to the contrary and find yourself frustrated and disappointed perpetually. So what does he go on to tell us? Number 2, life and death, they're not subject to predictability. If your abilities can't glean and gain you every single time what you wish and want, then what do we need to understand further? Life and death are not subject to predictability. We can't know the details, in other words, of life and death. Solomon continues in verse 12 by again showing mankind's ignorance of the future, specifically our own future. This usage here in verse number 12, note what he says, for man also knoweth not his time. Note the end there. The sons of men are snared in an evil time when it falleth suddenly upon him. The usages of his time and evil time could indicate the span of life, including death as well, or it could be perhaps applied just to death exclusively. Either way, both events, life in its span and death in its event, are unpredictable, and frankly, they're unavoidable. Whenever it overtakes us, it says it traps us as if there is no escape. And so he gives us an illustration there to try to help us. Note what I put on the screen. Consider Long John Silver's in KFC. You say, what does that have to do with verse 12? Well, stick with me for a moment here. Note what he says here. For a man also knoweth not his time, as or just like the fishes that are taken in an evil net, and as the birds that are caught in a snare. Now, I'm not much of an outdoorsman. Shock, I know. But if you go a-fishing, do the fish know you're coming? No, they don't know you're coming. And his times, they used a little bit of pole and makeshift hooks, but typically what did they use? Nets that they would try to drag and grab as many fish as possible. Do those fish know until that net's almost on them, that net's almost on them? Do they know till they're getting wrapped up in that net and dragged into the boat that they're out of the water? Not till they're out of the water. Do they know they're going to be dinner for somebody or in the market by that afternoon? Do they know that? They don't. Now, somebody may say, that's a really silly illustration. It's Solomon's. Be upset with him about it. But the point he's trying to make is this. Life and death are not subject to predictability. Fish have no clue they're going to get taken up in that net and be dinner that night. He goes further and says, think about birds. They would create snares for those birds, whether it was some kind of loop and cover it with brush or some kind of box or some kind of cage situation with food inside. We're not sure exactly what kind of drop lever system they use to trap those birds. But at the end of the day, a hunter would make some kind of snare to lure and snag that bird. Does that bird know that snare's coming? If he did, or she did, and they had the cognitive capacity, what do you think they'd do if they knew that snag was coming their way or snare was coming their way? They wouldn't go into it, right? They wouldn't do it. Do they know they're going to be dinner by that night? No, they don't. It's completely unpredictable. They have no clue that it's going to be taking place. So what is he trying to say to us? When it's the least expected, fishes don't know they're going to be netted. Birds don't know they're going to be snared. There are considerable limits to their ability to predict or escape such ensnarement. Conversely, then, there are many decisions outside their own control that lead up to that moment of ensnarement. What's he wanting us to recognize? My friends, he wants us to understand we don't know and can never fully know the details of life and death. Life and death are not subject to predictability, and as such, life and death will not always be just or fair by our standards. Note what he says here after the birds and fish illustration. As the birds that are caught in the snare, so are the sons of men snared in an evil time. If birds and fishes didn't know they would end up as Long John Silver's and KFC, it seems to reason, conversely, that you and I do not understand that our lives won't be what we think they'll be. And there will be sudden shifts. Now, he's not blaming God here for the evil departures of either. He's not saying because life doesn't go the way you wanted and because death doesn't come when you wanted that God is being unjust or unfair. He is saying most of this has to do with mankind. Us as sinners, them as sinners. Further, to live with a delusional verse 11 mindset. The race is to the strong. If I'll just put my abilities to work, I'll get what I want every time. He says that's delusional, and Solomon warns us it will only grant us greater frustration with the unpredictability of life. Life is filled with choices. Choices well beyond our control. Our sin-cursed world is filled with issues beyond our control. Sinful humanity continually makes choices beyond our control. Those elements combined, they are swirling around us every single day. Their effects make themselves known randomly and in unexpected times and manners to us. That's why he says here at the end of verse 12, note what he says. He says, they're snared in an evil time when it falleth, what's the word? Suddenly upon them. Suddenly upon them. The idea here, when he says these events, these times, these snares will fall suddenly upon us in life and even at the time of death perhaps, the idea is of a collapsing or dropping out without warning. Maybe I could illustrate it like this. I was helping repair a roof one time, and we had stripped away all the layers of shingles, and we were down to just the decking. And as we were walking around, it seemed to be that it had sure footing. This has happened to me more than once, so roofing, it does that. I'm walking along, and I'm walking with confidence, meaning I'm on the decking, not doing this. Sometimes you do that when you roof. I'm walking along, and all of a sudden, my left leg goes all the way through, and my knee is up at my face. And this has happened more than once to me. I had no idea it was soft in that spot. I did not know my foot would go through. If I had known, what would I have probably done? Not gone to that spot, avoided that spot. Because truthfully, what could have happened? One leg going through, your other leg being bent up towards you. I could have had all sorts of tendon issues. I could have had all sorts of breakage or rupture issues. Thankfully, I didn't, but I had no clue it was coming. It just collapsed that fast. He says, listen, that's how life and death are. Just like that, it can collapse, dink, on you or I to the point where we didn't see it coming. We didn't expect it. We didn't know what was going on. We may have been even walking confidently of what we were sure of. Oh, well, I've got 3 more years till retirement, or I've got 7 more years till paying off the house, or I've got 2 more till I'm ready for this new promotion. But Solomon says, I want you to be cautious. You be very cautious about living a life that you've framed on assurances that 2 plus 2, as it were, equals 4. That you've anchored your life to predictable assumptions in your manner of thinking and in your methodology in this world, because life nor death is subject to predictability. Now, is Solomon calling for you and I to live unattached because of that? No, that's not what he's saying. He's talked to us about enjoying life, being active in life, being a part of life. It doesn't mean that we don't give effort, diligence, or investment because of the unpredictability of life. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean to keep people at arm's length, to avoid hurt from them in an unpredictable life. Simply put, he's saying this: life is unpredictable. Therefore, practice what I told you in verses 7 through 10, that carpe diem mentality he talked about, and you will go forward. But life and death, my friend, don't forget, they are subject to chance and circumstance in our mind, but care from God and also the allowance of man in our realm. So what does he say to do then? If our abilities cannot just make our lives predictable and rewarded the way we think they ought to be, and if we are not able to conform life and death to our manner of assumptions or desires, what should we do? We should live wisely, though it runs contrary to the world's wisdom around us. Solomon here gives his stamp of approval on verse number 13 of something he's watched in a parable he'll create for us, or something he's watched, and he gives it in a parabolic fashion to us. Note what he says in verse 13. This wisdom have I seen also under the sun, the way this should be amongst men. And it seemed great unto me. Seeing that life is lived under a death sentence is incredibly unpredictable, he tells us this parable to help us gain perspective. In this story, his aim is to help us examine why it's better to live with wisdom. He's calling us to do that rather than try to live on this false level of predictability or assumptiveness that we might want to do. So he gives us this parable of an impossible scenario in verse number 14. He says there's this little city and few men within it and a great king who comes against it. Solomon describes here, maybe for his reader, a harrowing situation. In this parable, there's a small city besieged by a king, and based on the description, this city is in a very vulnerable situation. It's a small city with few men. And their time period, that would mean this: they have less resources, less defenses, and less allies for an armed response if they were threatened. But then they're besieged by a king that then would have vast resources. Due to his amount of resources, I should say, he would have vast things at his disposal. He'd have no trouble, as it says here, erecting bulwarks against it. Bulwarks were either mechanical devices or fashion devices or just dirt moved up against the wall to either scale the wall or stop anybody from being able to get into the city. So in short, he says, in this parable, there is a small city that's already vulnerable. It's so small, there's only a few men to give an armed response. They probably don't have the wherewithal to have plenty of allies. And now this king of unlimited resources has come against them. He's cut the city off. He's bounded up the bulwarks. There's nothing coming in. There's nothing going out. This king will be able to deal with any resistance the city may pull it up. And so what are we saying? In this parable Solomon gives, imagine the city that's completely at the king's discretion and mercy. It's an impossible situation. So in this parable, he says this: all was not to be lost, as there was somebody in the city who could have helped out if the city had appealed to him. And so he says there were unappreciated efforts due to the wrong value that the people in this parable would have held. And so he describes that in verse 15. Now there was found in it a poor wise man, and he by his wisdom delivered the city. Yet no man remembered that same poor man. Then said I, wisdom is better than strength. Nevertheless, the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. In this parable, he says there's this poor wise man. The usage is to demonstrate that the individual did not have the pedigree or the platform that mankind would naturally appeal to. He is contrary to how they would think they would deal with the situation. The only weapon this man had was his wisdom. This illustrates the point to us that wisdom was something practical and could help somebody with everyday situations in an unpredictable world. But the world didn't want that. They wanted somebody listed like in verse number 17, where it's the cry of him that ruleth among the fools. They wanted somebody with pedigree. They wanted somebody with platform to help them. And here it says this poor man in verse number 15, by his wisdom, delivered the city. Now, I'll just tell you, there is debate here as to whether this indicates the poor wise man was consulted and thereby helped deliver the city in this parable, or the opposite, that due to his standing, though he had the answers, he was ignored, and thus the city fell. Now, if we accept the former, that the wise man was consulted and the city was saved, it means those around him completely forgot about him, as it says there in the end of verse number 15. But if we accept the latter, that he was there and he could have delivered the city, but they did not hear his words and they despised his words, it means that he had the opportunity but was unheard and unremembered by those in power. Based on the verbiage in verse number 16, that he was despised and not heard, and based on the verbiage in verse number 17 and 18, the latter seems to be contextually accurate. In this parable, Solomon's saying there was somebody who could have helped them in this city, somebody who was willing to have help for them as a wise man, and yet they did not appeal to him because it was contrary to who they would want to say it and how he would say it. He may have desired and even attempted to get them to heed his instruction, but due to his way of life, he was viewed as wrong. And so Solomon highlights that as a parable illustrates the power of wisdom with those who will yield themselves to it, and the folly of those who will not appeal to wisdom because they want to walk in man's wisdom, not God's. And so note what he says in verse 17. The words of the wise men are heard in quiet more than the cries of him that ruleth among fools. And wisdom is better than weapons of war. Verse number 17, Solomon outlines wisdom's power versus folly's eventual destination. He describes the wise man's words as being heard by those who are willing to hear it. When he says that the wise man's words are heard in quiet, he is indicating that people are willing to sit without objection and not just be receptive, but be teachable. Not just be teachable, but act upon it. Be persuaded based on this man's ability to tell them about the God in heaven and his works amongst men. Because of his reverence towards God, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and so he would be able to, with wisdom, help them work through the unpredictability of this life. He doesn't have all the answers, but he can help them with wisdom to provide security towards them in an unpredictable life. Solomon gives his estimations on both. Wisdom has more power in regards to living this life than weapons of war have in procuring something for us in this physical existence. Someone without wisdom is dangerous. Dangerous to themselves, dangerous to all the things they are involved in. He says it only takes one fool to destroy much good. In his parable, he relates it to somebody in a position of authority making foolish decisions, trying to be assumptuous about the predictability of this life. And he says that one fool, though he may be boisterous, though he may have a platform, though he may have even a position of political power, as he's a ruler there amongst the people, just because he has all that doesn't mean it's going to end well. In fact, it will be harmful and detrimental to all those around them. Solomon's conclusion is that due to the unpredictability of life, we should live wisely in reverence of God. Even if it seems that we're out of step with the culture around us, even if it seems as if we are unappreciated by the culture around us, which shouldn't surprise us, he still says in verse 13, 16, and 18 that it's better to live wise in an unpredictable life. It's better to have that wisdom. It's better to operate upon that wisdom. It's stronger to live that way in an unpredictable life than to go the other way. So you cannot control the choices of others, but you can be a conduit of grace amongst those who are under the sun for them to see our God in our lives that are unpredictable. The impossible situations in life or death, they may not be able to be changed. They may not be able to be altered or avoided, but we can appeal to those around us based on God's word with his wisdom. Some might heed it. Largely, I imagine, most of it will go ignored as it is contrary to human desire. But at the end of the day, you and I can live wisely, though it's contrary to everything around us. So where does that leave us? If life is unpredictable, it's not subject to predictability, our abilities can't change that concretely for us, and we are to live with wisdom, what does it really boil down to? Well, I'll close tonight with this quote. Since death is unavoidable and life is unpredictable, the only course we can safely take is to yield ourselves into the hand of God and walk by faith in his word. We don't live by explanations, we live by promises. We don't depend on luck, but on the providential working of our loving Father as we trust his promises and we obey his will. This is how we live a life that's based in and based upon, frankly, unpredictability. See, uncertainty with man and the unknowns we have with our God call us then to this simple choice: live out our days wisely. I don't know what's coming in your life, but I do know your abilities will not make it exactly what you want it, when you want it, how you want it, with who you want it. I know that. Solomon tells us as such. I don't know what's coming down the pike because life and death are not subject to predictability. Whether you're young or old, we don't rely upon those things, and we can't rely upon those things. Good health, poor health, riches, poorness, intellect or not, those things are not the predictable, assumptuous things we think they are in our way of thinking under the sun. At the end of the day, you woke up today, and you need to operate on what he said in verses 7 through 10, and just avail yourself in reverence to the Lord and yieldedness to him and say, God, this is your day. You're sufficient. I need your help. I need your wisdom to go through this day. I can't change the choices of others. I can't change even some of my own choices because of the power of my own flesh and sin nature. So I need your help. I need your grace. I need your wisdom. I need your mercy. I need you to help me go through today to honor you and then to do your work through my life towards others that you have put around me on purpose. And so when you come to that first crossroads that you didn't predict or didn't want, you can trust God. It can let him work in and through your life. When next week something takes place that you didn't expect or you couldn't predict or you thought you had insulated yourself from or against, you can still trust God because life is unpredictable. It's uncertain. It is unknown. But you can trust your God through it. You can live, as he used in this parable, the poor wise man, and have a life that has security in God rather than security about what we think we can put our trust in to provide us security. So tonight, my friends, We may be living with a death sentence, as he said in verses 1 through 10, and we may be living an unpredictable life, but we have a God who is more than able and sufficient, and we do get to enjoy a blessed existence, though it may not always fit the form we have in our mind of such an existence. Let's take a moment tonight and have a word of prayer. And I just want to challenge and encourage you in this moment. Perhaps tonight you're here and something that's been unpredictable in your life has been nagging you, bothering you, you're struggling with it, you're frustrated by it, you think God's been unfair towards you in some capacity. And I just want to challenge you tonight. Your abilities can't change it alone. And it is not going to ever be subject to predictability, so choose to ask for God's wisdom and help through it. Father, in this moment, as our hearts are here before you, may we be yielded and say we need your help. Lord, I fear often I'm like that fish, like that bird. I'm trying to get this or do that or avoid this or avoid that, and I really don't even know what's coming. And so much of our lives are wrapped in question marks. We think we have to undo them and solve them, and yet, Lord, that's not what you called us to do. You called us to live with your wisdom each day, rely upon you each day. Don't to rely upon ourselves or our estimations. Don't put all our trust on the things of this earth, but put our trust in you, our God, and trust you. We have your promises. So, Lord, help us to be yielded tonight. Help us as we go our ways this evening in a song of praise. May our hearts be lifted up. May we be encouraged, and may we see what you're going to do through our lives tomorrow. And this we ask in Christ's name. Amen. I want to remind you to pray for the Doolin service tomorrow. And Brother Nate's going to come and lead us in a song of praise in a moment. But I'm going to ask you to pray for all the teens who came this evening. The Lord to keep working in their life and be able to see good things in the follow-up there. And then again, as I stated, that you'd pray for the Doolin family, just what is going to take place and how God's going to work in and through their lives tomorrow at the memorial. Let's all stand together as Brother Nate leads us in a song of praise.
Turn please with me to page 109. We'll sing Standing on the Promises of God. I can't think of a more fitting thing to sing about than trusting in his promises. Page 109. Standing on the promises of Christ my King, through eternal ages let his praises ring. Glory in the highest I will shout and sing, standing on the promises of God. Standing, standing, standing on the promises of God my Savior. Standing, standing, I'm standing on the promises of God. Let's sing the last verse. Standing on the promises I cannot fall, listening every moment to the Spirit's call, resting in my Savior as my all in all, standing on the promises of God. Standing, standing, standing on the promises of God, my Savior. Standing, standing, I'm standing on the promises of God. May be blessed in your week. You are dismissed.